My name's CM Hall. I'm ALF Class 35. I hail from now Newport, Oregon. I'm a lifelong Oregonian, and in my day job, I'm a sign language interpreter, and I am a director of a federal grant that trains sign language interpreters to work with people who are both deaf and blind. And then in my free time, I'm a Newport City Councilor, and I also teach LGBTQ studies at Western Oregon University. I'm pleased to be able to bring you this program today. This is an effort of a group of ALF Senior Fellows to think through what do we want to do? What do we want to provide to ALF Senior Fellows to continue to engage with one another, continue to connect with one another? There was a survey done, and really that was the big piece, is continuing to bridge that rural and urban divide, continuing to connect beyond our ALF class experience. And what really started with a small group of people has kind of hopefully will become a frame for a series. And this is the first of it, called What Now, What Then? And we are really looking specifically at COVID-19, but I think we could probably throw in what was going on with the wildfires that were happening. And we are really bringing in two of our ALF Senior Fellows to hear from them and their unique experiences and how they are looking at what the pandemic is and how it's impacting communities, and really looking at the racial and economic disparities that are existing in COVID times and what is beyond. How I think I became the moderator for this was that as an ALF Senior Fellow and discussing this, I was just going about my regular day job when in June in Newport, Oregon, we saw a huge spike from single-digit numbers of COVID cases in Lincoln County to over 300 instantly because of an outbreak at a fish processing plant. And nearly all of those cases were identified folks who are Latinx and Indigenous. So it was immediately apparent that this was hitting our community in a very unique way that we had to respond to. And I set up a COVID call center here in Lincoln County to address that and have bilingual folks on those calls to help answer questions, help get people tested, contact tracing happening. So it just became immediately in focus in a way that when I was working from home, it hadn't had that direct impact. So that's kind of the background on how we came to be here. I'd like to just go ahead and introduce both of our panelists this morning, and I'm going to read their bios if you'll indulge me. I'm going to start with Ebony. Ebony Clarke is the director of Multnomah County Behavioral Health Division. She's a licensed clinical social worker who has 24 years of experience working in both the publicly funded and nonprofit behavioral health arena, developing services and supports, providing leadership, organizational development, people management, and equity and inclusion. Ebony joined Multnomah Counties in 2010 and stepped in as the senior manager of direct clinical services. Before joining the county, she worked as a service director of child and family services at LifeWorks Northwest. And in that role, she oversaw child and family outpatient mental health, prevention, and culturally specific adult mental health and addiction services. She has an undergraduate degree in Bachelor of Arts from the University of Oregon and a master's degree in social work from Portland State. And Oregon Governor John Kitzhaber appointed Ebony to the Oregon State Board of Licensed Social Workers, where she served 2 terms. She's also volunteered her time on the Lake Oswego School District Board, appointed Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and served as one of their co-chairs. Her mission is to build and support a continuum of care that yields equitable and quality services to promote individual, family, and community healing and well-being. And with all of her free time, that's a lot. So I don't know where she finds that extra time. She does spend it with her family, with her husband of 18 years, Matt, and their 2 sons, Mateo and Miles, age 13 and 8. Welcome, Ebony. Thank you so much for being here. And then I'm going to also introduce Anthony Veliz. Anthony is the founder and owner of IZO, and I'm not sure if that's supposed to be pronounced or if it's just the letters, IZO. You'll let me know. Public relations and marketing, a multicultural agency specializing in the Latino community. And recently launched STORI. Is that story? Again, not certain if it's in, okay, great, you're nodding. A digital diversity and inclusion recruitment platform targeting diverse college, university students, and millennials. Anthony has consulted with many public and private sector organizations on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and recruitment. And his expertise on the growing Latino community of Oregon is unmatched. He's the son of farm workers and has always had a passion for the community of Woodburn, where he lives and works. Anthony has earned the trust of the community as the first Latino ever elected to the Woodburn School District School Board, and only the second Latino elected to serve on the city council in the city of Woodburn. And he recently helped launch helped secure, $1 million through the Oregon Lottery for a new community center. His work as the former U.S. Community Relations Manager for the Beaverton-based Nike to Director of Parent and Community Relations for the Woodburn School District, all of that gives him a unique perspective on the Latino community at both the national and local levels. And he has a passion for public service with 30 plus years at the local, state, and national level, and has served on a number of boards. He has a master's degree from the University of Rhode Island and a bachelor's in marketing from Portland State. These are illustrious and esteemed senior fellows. Welcome to you both. I'm so glad that you're with us today. Thank you. I really would love to hear from you to really start this off. And I just want to give you kind of a broad beginner question, Anthony and Ebony. What are you observing right now in terms of COVID, in terms of, you know, how we are all absorbing and enduring a global pandemic, in addition to the climate injustice of wildfires? I'd love to hear your take. And Anthony, do you mind, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Buenos dias, all ALF and ALF fellows. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here for you. I'm here actually at Capaces Leadership Institute in Woodburn, Oregon, and we are actually doing some work that will be impacting the Latinx community statewide. And thank you so much again for having me. And I think, you know, as it relates to the Latino community, well, first of all, let me say Happy Hispanic Heritage Month, September 15th through October 15th, where we honor the contributions of Latinos and Latinx people, not only in Oregon, but across this country. So, but, you know, to answer your question, the COVID-19 has been devastating to the Latino community. We know that there's already been health disparities, and all of the disparities actually, and this just even exacerbated it. Around that, some of the work that I've done, I founded the Oregon Latinx Leadership Network, which comprises of over 80 plus CBOs from all over the state of Oregon. And we've galvanized, I started this movement, and we've galvanized our community. Unprecedented, first time I think it's ever been done. And so it's really, really exciting. But what the stories are is not good. I mean, if you look at all the hot spots across the state of Oregon and the zip codes, they are very high Latinx communities, right? From Woodburn to Ontario to Hermiston. And what ties a lot of those is the agriculture industry and the community there. So as all of us here are privileged to be sitting here in the comforts of our homes or work spaces, today, right now, we have people that are working out in the fields in these, some people characterize as the worst air quality conditions in the world. And our people have continued to basically try to work because of necessity. And we are blessed to have the food on our table because of their work. So it's very humbling to think about it that way, but I think I'll leave it at that. So and we can continue with Ebony, I guess.
And Ebony, before you speak, I just thought I would say, like, the first part of this is going to be really thinking about the what is presently happening, the what now, and then we're going to pivot to thinking about what does a post-COVID global pandemic look like in our communities? How do we work better, smarter? How are we better able to integrate and collaborate in terms of service provision, connect with one another? So there will be that pivot, but right now we're really looking at what are you observing presently? Ebony.
Yes, first off, I just would like again to thank Lisa, for inviting me to participate, and I'm honored to be able to participate in a conversation with both Anthony and CM. You know, just what am I seeing? I think within my role, I have the ability to kind of see the impact of the pandemics, multiple, and the civil unrest, and now the wildfires and the smoke. And there's an individual impact that I'm seeing. I'm seeing a systemic impact in addition to community impact. You know, I think it's important, as Anthony spoke to, is that, you know, we have to be intentional about also calling out and not glossing over that this continues to impact the Latinx community, the Pacific Islander community, and the Black community, in addition to the Asian community. And then we're seeing significant impact with older adults. You know, so there are some, you know, while we all are impacted, there's some hardest hit communities that we have to be intentional about. What am I seeing? Honestly, I'm starting to see eyes open up as this is actually starting to create a level playing field in terms of, it's not, you know, we all are impacted, and because we all are impacted, now folks are starting to just be a little bit more intentional, where again, there's a lot of conversation about the hardest impacted communities. But I want to reiterate is that this is nothing new, and this is not surprising. There has always been disparities and overrepresentation in just how our BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are impacted. Specifically, we're seeing fatigue, especially by the frontline workers, the essential workers, the healthcare providers, and I want to specifically call out the social workers and our behavioral health providers specifically. We're seeing economic impact, and again, obviously, it's exacerbated in the Latinx, Pacific Islander, and Black community. We're seeing impact within our healthcare system. So I can go on. I'm mindful of time, so I'll end there.
Well, actually, both of you hinted at something I wanted to ask for a next question. We're talking in a lot of generalities, and I think sometimes the stories that hit home the most is when we have real life examples of how communities have been disproportionately impacted. And I'm wondering if you have any particular examples where you've noticed from your experience since kind of the confluence of COVID and Black Lives Matter and racial injustice coming to kind of that boiling point. Can you give any kind of examples of what you're seeing out there, families that have had to have had to endure all of this, or the challenges that have been met because of COVID, because they've been frontline workers, because of having to like rally and protest and demonstrate for Black Lives Matter?
You know, so some specific stories that resonate with me are the stories of a single parent household, a single Black mother raising her kids, who at the beginning of the impact lost her job, didn't have the resources to ensure that her children could do online schooling. On top of that, concerns about you know, what are the resources and what's the level of access for the Black community in terms of being able to get tested, let alone treatment. And so, you know, I think early on within the pandemic specific to COVID, we were seeing a lack of PPE. We were seeing a lack of testing sites, especially for our BIPOC community. And as I said earlier, you know, all this does is just exacerbate what currently exists. On top of now, yes, the civil unrest specific to police brutality, the unnecessary killing of Black men and Black women, in addition to just the issues specific to structural and systemic racism. What are we seeing? We're starting to see, you know, and I'll talk a little bit later because, you know, I do want to talk about some of the silver lining, if you will, in terms of folks starting to feel courageous enough, the dominant culture, white folks starting to feel courageous enough to step up. I will talk about that later on. But I think it's just, honestly, it's a public health crisis. Outside of just COVID-19, racism is a public health crisis. So we have two public health crises right now. We're experiencing two pandemics on top of then the issues of the wildfires and the smoke. And so what am I seeing also? I'm seeing a stretched system that is highly fatigued. But what I'm seeing is the courage and the willingness to continue to fight, to try to leverage this opportunity as we have the attention of decision makers and policy makers to begin to create some equity when it comes to addressing and serving the needs of our BIPOC community.
Anthony.
Great question, CM. And let me just start out by saying, when we started the Latinx, the OAN movement, here's who we had in mind. We had in mind the undocumented, the immigrant, the indigenous Mesoamerican, the poor, the hungry, the homeless, the incarcerated, and the voiceless. And what we found out now through this COVID-19 is that our systems are not set up for that group of people. The group of people that have always been last, the systems do not know how to understand how to put them first for once in our history. And it still continues. And that's what I'm seeing, especially with the undocumented. I think the story is they have absolutely no access to any federal resources. So, and that's why they are out there in the fields and other places working through this terrible time. And so the stories I would say, just regarding we'll say health or the COVID-19 is just that we have in the coast, well, in the fire area that I've heard of stories of women who are out there working and have passed out. Because I don't know if you can, we are complaining if we have to run from our car to the store, right? Well, these people are working out there 10 to 12 hours a day in that every day. And I'm not talking every day, it's like they're working today, right? And so I don't think we really have an idea about what that is, right? And I hear that some of them don't even have masks. So just imagine that, right? In the world and being in the middle of the world's worst air quality and working all day. Think about that. I think another story that regarding the whole George Floyd and this global movement is one thing that I've seen is that the solidarity between the Latinx and the African American community, and that that's just there. I think it's always been there, but it was really great to see it now visually, even more so. And I think the stories that's really hard is that, let me give you an example. I had a family that was undocumented driving to work. They got pulled over. The first thing they thought was, am I gonna die? And they, have seen what we've seen on TV, right? So they literally, this is an undocumented family, very humble family. First thing they did, put your hands on the dash, put your hands, the kids, the people in the back seat, put them on the front seat, and put your hands at 2 o'clock, 10 and 2, right? And they were literally at fear of being pulled over by a police officer. The good news is they tell me the story is that he was a nice person and they worked through that, getting pulled over. But I think that's basically what is out there in the Latinx community. It's fear, fear of law enforcement, fear of ICE, fear of dying, right? Contracting COVID-19, and that's real. And I don't know if anybody here has ever lived in fear for longer than a day, but there are people that are walking in that every single day of their lives.
And I just want to add again that what we're seeing, this is not new. The disparities, the overrepresentation, the racism, whether it's systemic, individual, it's not new. What's new is that, as I said earlier, our policymakers, our decision makers, our cities are starting to have a higher level of awareness. What's new or what's different is that we're starting to also see evidence that cannot be swept under the rug of the disconnect of our policymakers to our communities of color. On the positive side, what's new? We're starting to see there may be space and opportunity for accountability. And, I know that, there may be is the key word. So just want to reiterate that.
Thank you. I wanted to share two examples of what I witnessed as a part of the outbreak in Lincoln County and what we were hearing at the call center on the calls. Families who are undocumented, living 6-7 people in like a 1-bedroom apartment. And if one person or 2 people were positive COVID tests, they had to isolate, but there was nowhere to isolate to. And then you also had kids in the home who were supposed to be doing online schooling. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were multiple stories like this. And then because of being undocumented, not being able to access the same social service safety net that other people could if they were documented, right? And so what I did find, and this is kind of, we're not pivoting yet to the what then, but like there was a community that really recognized this gap, that recognized the people who are falling through these cracks, and immediately set up like a fund to help support them. And that fund only, has gone so far, but there were still people who recognized that, and it's not enough. The other story that I noticed that was particularly interesting in terms of that racial frame was Lincoln County commissioners here, with best intention, all 3 Lincoln County commissioners are white. And they recognize that people of color are more highly likely to be profiled if they're wearing a mask. And you may have heard some of this may sound somewhat familiar. So they put in their policy, like, if you are a person of color and you feel like you might be racially profiled or discriminated by wearing a mask, you do not have to wear a mask. And this was June, which feels like a lifetime ago in terms of COVID. And it got fully twisted. The intent and the impact were very different in the sense that it was what they were aspiring to. We don't want people to be racially profiled and be more at risk for being discriminated against. But then it got twisted by right-wing propaganda. And so it was perceived as a racist policy. And then for a week and a half, calls were coming in nonstop because it got picked up by right-wing media sources, and just the phone number for the call center got blasted nationally. So people were calling and being super racist and super vile, and the people on the other end of the calls were people who were from immigrants from Mexico, who were bilingual, who were having to take these calls from people being really gross. So the intent and what ended up happening, and then they finally took that out, was so, like, in all of this that was going on in June, when right after George Floyd had been murdered, with all of this that was happening with COVID, it just was like one more thing of not our intent in terms of what ended up happening and how people took it the wrong way. And they ended up changing the policy to take that out and just say, everyone wear a mask. But that it was really an interesting spark for people to just be racist. And it was white people calling, being racist to the callers on the call. It was an ugly moment, but the intent was we want you to be safe. We want you to wear masks, but if you feel unsafe, if you wear a mask, you know, that was the intention. So.
CM, can I just say, that just makes me think about those examples of racism that that people of the non-dominant culture that are non-white experience. And so, you know, generally what we're also seeing is we're seeing increased mental health illness and challenges, anxiety, depression, suicide ideation. But then when you couple that or add the layer of racism, it's only compounded. And so then you're starting to see the impact of the historical and current trauma that's specific to racism. And then you look at, okay, so we live in the Pacific Northwest, and we know that there's issues of lack of culturally specific, I like to say racially responsive care. And so then, you know, imagine then the heightened symptomology that our people of color are experiencing as a result. And so there's that mental health component that I also want to put out there.
And Anthony.
No, I would just say, I think that racism, like, you know, we have to learn to live with it. As a young boy working in the fields, I got to see farm owners basically curse out my grandparents, my grandmother, my mom, my dad, my aunts and uncles. And so you grow up with that, you know it's there, and you get a thick skin around it. You know, I've dealt with that in a professional level. I was a director of communications here at the school district. Guess what? Every time I've fielded those calls at least once a week, right? So I think that it's there in a personal level and a professional level, and just don't think it's ignorant people. There's people that are educated and people with influence. I've received those same phone calls from people like that. So it's not just, it's a mindset, right? And it's a learned behavior, so to speak. But getting to like what you had talked about earlier, you know, I about the intent, you know, what people wanted to do and what came out. I think, you know, right now, what I would just say, I think what I always tell everybody in my own group, don't let perfection or fear stop progress, because it's muddy, right? When you talk about racism, discrimination, and just trying to make a difference, you could take race out of it, it's still muddy. It's community-based organizing and bridge building and all that. It's never easy. You could have all Latinos in a room or all kinds, and you still have situations, right? But obviously when it comes to, you know, when it comes more multicultural, multiracial, it has its own set of dynamics. So I think that, that's something important. What I will say too is just the response to a lot of this, like, you know, CMU set out in your neck of the woods, they actually did something. There's 36 counties across the state of Oregon, and probably I can count less than this hand how many actually people are doing something for people of color. I'm in Marion County. We invited ourselves to the table, but I can guarantee you there's probably about 30 counties across the state of Oregon that probably haven't spoken to one person of color about COVID-19 or anything else, is how it's impacted. And another thing I would leave with is, you had mentioned that the majority of the elected officials are white. That's true across the state of Oregon. So that's just a given. And as people of color, we have to navigate that and advocate, and we're used to it because it's always been like that. So that's not too new, but I think what's new is that the pain that's being felt, like Ebony had really said really well, that the pain now is in everybody's community and socioeconomic status, and that is really what woke people up. Because it wasn't that the racism, we finally focused on it. It's like, it's always been there. But when I feel the pain, then I'm not used to feeling that pain. Then I look to my left, I look to my right, and I'm saying, I'm no different. You know what I mean? This is impacting me in my pocket, or however it impacts you. And then that created this awareness that I think we're in.
So Anthony, I want to follow up with you and ask a different question then, because you said that, you know, with the 36 counties in Oregon, very few are really reaching out to the communities that are most impacted, disproportionately impacted. And a lot of those are service industry related, right? Like I guess I would say that fish processing is like food, and like, so I guess I would tie that to service, but like farm workers, it feels like service in the kind of that larger category. So what can senior fellows do because we have senior fellows in all the counties. So how can we make sure that those conversations are happening, even if they're not your own personal lived experience? Like, how can we ensure that those conversations are happening and that those services are getting out there to people who might be testing positive for COVID? Because for me in Lincoln County, what I did love was the intentionality around, we're going to have bilingual folks on the call center, and Spanish and English, and most of the calls are coming in Spanish. But then we recognized that there were Indigenous folks who are speaking MAM, M-A-M, and we needed to also bring in MAM fluent folks. So we had that training, and then all of the materials being produced in Spanish, in English, and in MAM, so that we were getting that out there, and not just using social media, because that's still a privilege for people who have data and Wi-Fi and internet access, but getting the word out in the communities and different social service points, drop points, essentially, to get the word out. What would you recommend for people to get their communities to be paying attention to these underrepresented folks who might be more disproportionately impacted?
Well, I would say humbly that each of our ALF Senior Fellows has a gift to share with the world, and I think you start there. What is your gift, right? And then you take it from there. But I think it starts with yourself, and then I think it starts with those that you love and care for, having these conversations, and then it spreads out, right? Because I think we always want to go big or go home, but it actually starts with right here, what's in there, right? And if once you understand that, then I think that you start spreading that message to the people that you know. And yes, do we want to get to the public elected officials? Yes, but we also want to get to corporate America. I don't know if corporate America has responded to, and I'll just specifically talk about my Latinx community in Southern Oregon, who over 500 people, for sure, families lost their homes in a few hours. I haven't heard a lot about that in the media, but there's a lot of communities of color that are hurting. And so I think, again, start with yourself. What's your sphere of influence, and what can you do? I don't expect anybody to do something that I'm doing, taking on this statewide movement, but I would like that you self-reflect, have this conversation with the community, the people in your homes, or the people that you love and care about, and then in your neighborhoods and your community, because this really does take a village. And let me give you an example of that. So I'll try to make it quick. So when I was growing up on 449 South Front Street near downtown Woodburn, Oregon, my grandparents and my parents and I, and we lived together. And we would always have, we always have people coming over, knocking on the door, and this is in Spanish, and say, we hear that you guys help people. And so my grandparents would invite them in, and they'd have all these envelopes that were closed, all these papers stacked. They couldn't read them. So that's what we did. And pretty soon, before you knew it, their kids were playing with my toys, which was annoying. No, I'm kidding. I was a little kid then. And then we'd be having dinner with them. And this just happened like just throughout my lifetime. Yesterday, guess what happened to me? Somebody comes knocking on my door. It was a Latino man, only spoke English. He said this, he goes, I was wondering if you could help me, because I guess it looked like somebody I could help. And he couldn't get on, his second grade son couldn't get on Zoom to take his class. So I walked in there. I'd never been in their home before, introduced myself and met the kids. And then I helped them username, password, and all that. So it truly takes a village. And I guess the rumor in Woodburn, it never went away regarding the Velizes here. So I guess that's what I'm blessed or burdened with to continue to do. So it truly takes a village.
It's the legacy of the Veliz name.
So Sam, I think that's a really great question. And, I reflect back to the pillars that we began to delve into at the beginning of our journey as we stepped into the community of ALF. And, I think about, there was some core kind of principles and values specific to recognizing that we are a community amongst ALF. And as we start to learn and grow together, how do we intentionally invest in connection, recognizing that through connection, we have the ability to impact the systems. And so, that's where my mind immediately went. And then also I know is that there are a lot of folks who either are decision makers, policy makers, or are connected to policymakers. And so I think too, it's us using the resource to learn from each other, but then using the position, using our positionality and leveraging the privilege that we hold within our positions to then advocate and influence, you know. So, you know, I work with Oregon Health Authority all the time. And so, you know, clearly I was speaking up in terms of how are we intentional? So in Multnomah County, you know, we have a lot of work to do, but we commit to leading with race. We commit to using an equity lens to look at how we step forward in every single situation, including what our emergency response is to these public health crises, the pandemic, the fires, so on and so forth. And so within that, I was able to then connect with the leaders of OHA to say, so how are you leading with race? How are you leveraging an equity lens? And within that, at least some of the COVID relief dollars that OHA received, they actually, for the first time ever, intentionally earmarked these dollars. 85% of those dollars were aimed and geared for the BIPOC community. And now, I mean, obviously everything's not perfect, but I'm just saying it's those small things that you can do, so.
And I guess I'll just speak at the awareness of folks in Oregon who are using more languages has been a net positive, I guess, in COVID times, because there are more materials being printed in other languages. There are sign language interpreters at these press conferences and news briefings. And that, to me, has that equity lens, kind of thinking about how are we reaching out to all Oregonians who are with us. I do want to pivot because Ebony, you just mentioned something that made me think, like, that privilege piece. It's not, there's a piece around white privilege, obviously, but there's also about networking. Like, how do you know the people at OHA? Like, and using those powers for good, right? When you know how to work through and navigate through the system, then you can affect that change in a way where you're talking to policymakers or you're talking to the government appointees who are a part of that. So I feel like that's a piece of kind of that shift of what then? Where do we go from here? COVID's going to be with us for a while. And you're starting to see some of the fatigue of having to endure this for 6 months already and recognize that we're probably in this for another year. Realistically, and trying to make a semblance of a life with a mask, you know, just in our everyday goings on. But when we look at like systems, education, we look at how we provide community services, what then? What do we see that is starting? You mentioned, I think, yeah, Ebony, you mentioned silver linings. I'm seeing a real generosity come out of this in a way that I feel like some of that apathy has been removed, and there's definitely more of an earnestness to engage and connect and have real connection. What are you seeing in terms of, you mentioned solidarity, Anthony, but like courage and that willingness to kind of be a part of a solution? What are you seeing out there in terms of, or what do you imagine we should look like post-COVID?
That's a great question. That's a lot but
yeah,
I think, you know,
3 words. I'm sure you can answer it. And yeah, just kidding.
Yeah, for sure. So system, you know, so as mentioned in my bio, you know, I'm a former school board member, city councilor, and I currently serve on the State Board of Education. So I definitely understand system, this policy stuff. But for me, I don't actually look at systems, because to me, systems have existed. It's an intangible thing, right? It doesn't really exist unless we just say a system. What I want to see and change moving forward are people. The people are the system, right? So if the system hasn't changed, it means the people haven't changed. The system is the system. I mean, what is it, right? It's a building, it's words on a paper, it's what you do today, what you don't do tomorrow, what you say yes to, what you say no to, but that's a personal decision, right? Based on all those kind of things. So I think it's what's coming, and I see And I'm looking at Tom, I'll call you out, Tom, but Tom is one of the most amazing people that I've ever met. I consider him a mentor, Tom Fuller, if you guys don't know Tom Fuller. And he's the people that I'm talking about. That's why I'm looking at you, Tom. He's the change. He's the change because he talks to me a lot about his family and how they were and how he chose to make the change that he wanted to see in himself, in his community, in the world. So to me, systems are like, it's just a word, right? And this is because I'm a very grassroots person. It doesn't mean that I don't understand them and the complexity and how they can move mountains, but I'll go back to the person, that'll always back. And pivoting to like the giving, I think that there's been an outpouring, of that, of people, again, creating the awareness, but money is not gonna, it comes and goes, right? I always go back to the people and your heart and your mentality and what you decide to do today or not to do. If you decide to advocate, I think even before we get into these systems, I think, has anybody gone out and walked down the street and said hi to your neighbor, ask them how they're doing? I think that's where you start, right? And I hope that'd be awesome if a lot of you have, but that's really hard for people. The majority of people don't do that, right? And I think if we can't even start there with people that we live next to, it's really hard to get to the bigger picture. So that might not be, the system, but I do think at the end of the day, the systems have existed for decades, generations. I know we got to work on policy change. We're doing that at the State Board of Education. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you have the wrong people in there. You could have the best policies in the world, but they don't act on it. It doesn't really move the dial. So that's my thoughts on that.
Ebony?
I think for me, and I appreciate what Anthony said, because it's about people, for me, as a Black woman, as a public administrator, as a native to Oregon, as a native to Portland, it's about people, it is about policy, and it is about system, because unfortunately, I personally have experienced and I witnessed, regardless of the good nature or good intent of people, the policy oppress and keep our people down. So for me, it's people, policy, and system, because it's the system, because regardless, there's systems that criminalize mental illness. There's systems that criminalize Black and brown skin. There's systems that prevent our children of color from being properly educated. And so those are just a couple of examples. And so, I think it's about a collective whole. And so how do we, again, looking at an individual system and policy level, how do we, work collectively? And how do we, what I always talk about is that there are such innovative and great strategies and efforts that happen at the ground level all the time. But what happens is that those efforts are not sustained because the policy blocks it. And so I think what we have to do is we have to remember to come full circle. We have to remember to cross our T's and dot our I's, so that we can then go back and influence policy so that our efforts can be sustained. Because I think a lot of times, people forget that those policies were created, decades ago, hundreds of years ago, and there was a completely different mentality. And so, we got to think about that. Also, what I see and what gives me hope, what inspires me is that I think, and again, I'm a person of color, so I don't know, but I believe that because our white communities and our white brothers and sisters are collectively speaking up, white people are gaining the courage to push back and to say, this is not okay. Something has to change. And honestly, as a Black woman, did I ever think I was gonna see that in my lifetime? No. And you see it in Oregon, and you see it, you know, people are in Southern Oregon, you know, protesting. People are in Eastern Oregon protesting. Outside is just internationally and around the world. And so, you know, that gives me hope. And so for me, it's how do we leverage the opportunity as we have this collective desire and motivation to implement and sustain change. So.
And I think you've probably heard this also. I mean, I think this is something that's commonly been said, is the attention paid on, unfortunately, the police brutality and murder of George Floyd. We would not have been awakened to that fully had we not been in a pandemic and all been quarantined. And so that is it's hard to say that's a good thing, because we know that that's tragedy, and at the same time it jostled people, right? It jostled white dominant culture in a way that we hadn't necessarily, we the largest of we hadn't necessarily got it. And it felt like individual isolated incidents, and then you started to see like, oh no, this is a pattern. Oh no, this is a system of cover your ass, right? Like bury it, like just not really, you know, and so it felt like fringy. And now we recognize, unfortunately, and people, Black people, people of color have recognized this for far too long. So I guess that's an outcome of this. The next question came from someone in this session. Can you address the role that trust and trust building plays in how we can change systems and be better responders to these challenges in regards to COVID, in regards to fires, regards to systemic racism?
Yeah, so that makes me think, and I'm sure that many of you have read about this and probably been in discussions about this, but you know, I feel like maybe every 5 years, there's always new terminology when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so right now, there's this conversation of what does it look like to be a white ally as compared to a co-conspirator. And so to me, it's about action, and it's about individual accountability. And it's about, you know, educating and informing yourself, and then leveraging that to bring your piece to the table. You know, I think oftentimes what happens, you know, so we all can see that everyone is just exhausted and mentally burned out. And so, you know, people of color are feeling the same way when it comes to raising the issue of racism. We've spent our entire life trying to convince dominant culture that racism exists. And now finally people are like, okay, but then what happens is that they're like, okay, something's wrong, tell us what's wrong. So then we have to retell what's going on, which makes us feel like, well, and people are like, well, I'm just here to listen. Well, I've been talking all my life. So that tells me that you haven't been listening. I don't want you to listen anymore, because that's been ineffective. And so how do you get to this place of action? And then again, you know, just not relying on people of color to do all the work to then say, okay, so based on what you have brought before me, this makes sense. And so I will take A, C, and F. But, you know I'm starting to be super circular, but again, it's about how do we collectively own our responsibility. And I'll just say this, as a person of color, you know, I don't expect a white person to understand what it's like to be and live in my shoes. However, as you start to experience and come across opportunities where your eyes are opening up, where then you're starting to see it, then what my ask is that you leverage your voice, leverage your position, leverage your privilege, because, you know, and a lot of times people are like, well, I'm one person. I can't, you know, get to the governor. I'm one person. I can't change the rules. I can't end racism. But remember, you know, the power of one is remarkable. You know, I think we all can think of individual stories where we've done some of our own work, regardless of what the topic is. And then when we talk to one person, and then they talk to the next person, and you start to see this ripple effect. I'm going to be quiet because I'm rambling, so thanks.
Maybe I could jump in here because Anthony said some very nice things about me, but I'm a white man of privilege. I grew up, I'm a fifth generation farm kid. Our farm was between McMinnville and Sheridan. And in the spring of my senior year, I went to Washington, DC on a 4-H sponsored 2-week trip. And I came back with an extraordinary view that I had never experienced of how people of color were maligned and treated in our nation's capital. And one of my experiences was waiting for some Black people to get on a bus, because then I'd get on the bus. They were there when I arrived. And I got thoroughly dressed down by a white man saying that that was the wrong thing to do, that I had a right to get on first. And I came home and I sat my father down, who was a racist with a capital R, confronted him and never reconciled, because we were of such different views. As I think now about what kind of old guy that recently moved from Portland to Pacific City, which is not exactly the center of anything. Today I read how the President of the United States Senate, whose name I will not mention because I'm so furious, is going to fast track the nomination of a new Supreme Court justice with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg yesterday. This same SOB, when we had a Black man as president, would not allow a nominee to be considered because he wanted to wait until an election occurred, hoping that we would change from Democratic to Republican leadership. What I'm doing and committing to do is asking everyone I know to vote. One vote makes a difference. Some of you may have been elected to an office by 1 or 2 votes. We have a broken, dysfunctional system that disregards people if you are not like me. And it has to change or we're not going to survive. And I've been a longtime member of ALF. I'll admit I was in class 1. I have watched how this organization has grown and prospered. As some of you know, I'm fond of saying we never thought we'd get beyond 5 years. That was our whole focus. But I'm looking here at people like CM who went through a recent class. It is exactly what we had hoped for in spades. And I know now the power that committed individuals can bring. And what ALF does is it finds those people, it brings us together. We don't often agree, but I think we all are willing to engage. And my message to all of us is don't let this opportunity to engage go by and take the personal step of voting.
So, good, well said, Tom. So I wanted to just kind of get to that question I think that Lisa posed about trust. 2 things come to mind. It's all about relationships. And if that's how the Latino, Latinx community, that's our foundational premise, I guess. Let me give an example. I'm a business owner, and the way mainstream does business is let's do business and I get to know you along the way. But as a Latino business owner is, I want to get to know you first and then we can do business. So it's complete opposite. But I think that that's one thing. It's all about relationships. And there's another point that I want to make. Longevity has its place, because you can't build relationships just coming in and out of any community. You got to be there, right? For better, for worse, at least show up. And so that's what it's about. I know in the Latino community, it's all about relationships. And then once you still build relationships, you have trust. I think I'm an example of I'm class 15 and still here I am with ALF, trying to support everything that you're doing and being an advocate. And I have a lot of great relationships and especially trust. And I trust Alf with all my being. I trust all of you, we talk a lot about that, being safe and being a fellow. So I think that's, again, fundamentally, I always go back to the person, right? Who you are and what you want to do and what you choose to do with your life and your decisions. And I do understand, Ebony, people practicing policies. I think those were the exact words, but I agree with that 100%. But I'm just who I am, and I'm about relationships and people and trying to make the difference from a one-on-one person in the sphere of influence that we do have.
And I just want to add to that too. I always have to be myself, but I think, I'm always amazed because honestly, I never would have thought that I would have had the opportunity that I have today to do what I do, to be able to fight for not only my community, but everyone's community. And so, many of you probably, or maybe many of you don't know my story. I was born drug affected. I had heroin in my blood. I was placed immediately into foster care and was not reunited with my mother until I was a year and a half. The silver lining there is that I don't ever recall not being with my mother. Silver lining is that my mom committed to getting her life together so that she could get her children back. And I love today the work that I get to do to continue to give hope and demonstrate the ability of relationships and resiliency. But getting back to the piece around trust, because of the work that I do and because of my commitment in living out the value, I'm always thinking about policy. And one of the things that I've been talking a lot with our policymakers about is how do we start having this lens to recognize who's at the table and who's not? At minimum, use your data to determine who is it that you serve, and at minimum, aim to have that same representation at the table when you're making decisions, or aim to have that same representation when you're out connecting and hearing from folks, so that then as you're making decisions, you can ensure that the voice is represented. But as Anthony spoke to, it's about relationship. And through relationship, that's where you start to establish trust. But unfortunately, that takes time. And what happens is we have people suffering. And so how do we also start trusting those we serve? How do we also start trusting the community? And so, again, I'm going to go back to the policy and the system piece of, if this is not your community, and you recognize that there's a gap in relationship and connection, then how do you step aside and trust what the community is saying when they talk about what their experiences are, what it is that they need? How do you let the community begin to bring in their own processes of resiliency and healing to get to these places of wellness? And so just trying to look at a different side of trust. How do we begin to step aside and trust the people, as we are not the experts sometimes? So thank you.
That piece about looking at the data and making sure that you have a really representative sample of the people in leadership, the people who are creating and making that policy, I think is a really key part. Too often, I think in Oregon, there's, we have checked that box and we have that token identity represented, so we've addressed it. But the piece about looking at the data and really making sure that that's mirroring the number of people, I think is a critical piece. If we are looking at the what then, and we're looking at post-COVID, but we are creating that now, and bringing those people in, what do we want to create, or what systems currently exist that need to be more responsive, better improved, how can we work to build that now?
I guess I'll go, Ebony. I think that's a great question. And as it relates to the Latinx community, just so you know, there's over 565,000 Latinos across the state of Oregon, about 13.4%. 1 in 4 or 5 births in Oregon are Latino. And if we don't, that doesn't even count the 77,000 plus undocumented people. So we're probably, because there's always an undercount, over 600,000 Latinos across the state. So we're the largest ethnic minority in Oregon. And if you looked at the K-12 statistics, there's about 138,000 Latino students across the state, which is about 24%. So 1 in 4 basically of all K-12 students are Latinos. Now, let me pivot that to superintendents. I can count the number of Latino superintendents. Oh, hold on a second. Yeah, maybe there's 4 out of 197 school districts. So what's the math on that, right? So we do have a long way to go. So I think that the answer is we need equitable representation, leadership, period. But I'm going beyond just the public sector, not only the state, county, and city, municipality level, because that's where we talk a lot about, but I'm talking about the corporate and big business. We need more people at all levels, because it doesn't matter if you're public or private sector. You can, if you have diversity, you're gonna make better decisions. So let me give you, I can't remember the professor's name. I went to Portland State, and School of Business. And I'll never forget that my professor said, if you're starting a business, you wanna have people, a diverse group of people. You don't wanna have all marketing to start marketers in a company. You wanna have all accountants. You want an accountant, marketing, management, all of those, finance, somebody with, and it plays true just in life, right? Because we don't know what we don't know. And when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion, that's what corporate America is missing. That's what small businesses are missing. Or large, big companies, global, international companies, they're missing that because they're missing a market and they're missing probably products. Let me give you a fun example. My friend, Richard Montañez, was a custodian at Frito-Lay. It's been like 20 years ago. One day he brought home a batch of defected Cheetos. Guess what he did with them when he brought? He put Chile on them. Today we call those hot Cheetos. So he basically, a farm worker who worked at Frito, a former farm worker worked at Frito-Lay, to this day has only a 4th grade education, created a multi-billion global business for now PepsiCo. It's PepsiCo. And that's why diversity matters. Because if Richard doesn't do that, there is no hot Cheetos. And again, that might not be the most healthiest food in the world, but it is a business, right? And so what I'm saying is, he's a good friend of mine and a great speaker, but what I'm saying is diversity matters, not only in the public sector, because the private sector, to be honest, as a businessman, that's where all the money's at. And it's not about money, but if we're talking about resources and influence and power, I want to be on somebody's board of, right? Board, so I can influence it for good. I think we bring those. So I think, so that's kind of what I wanted to say about that. I think that so it would be diversity in representation. I think we need equitable distribution of resources, because we don't have a formula for that yet. I think people try to, it's more like just a reaction instead of a strategic investment in communities of color across the state of Oregon, in both urban and rural. So I think that's kind of the big pillars where I would start.
Anthony, I'm just going to ask and follow up, because that piece about that equitable distribution of resources, that word equitable sometimes can be skewed in the sense of, well, there's more people in like Multnomah County, so the resources should go there. But some of the rural communities are like, but we may have a more disproportionate group of people that are impacted. So do you have kind of a better working definition of what you mean in that sense of equitable?
That's a challenging one, but the best example I can use is Oregon Department of Education. They have a funding formula that's weighted based on different poverty, English language ability, all these kind of things. That's pretty much what I have seen in the state system that has equity, because it's not the same, right? Equality is not equity, right? Equity is exactly what you said. I do think we need to make a massive amount of investment in rural communities of Oregon. It's just a reality that it's very, they're farther apart, takes a lot more resources to get, and they need more help. So I think that's defined by state, county, city, but I do think that that's something that we need to put at the forefront. And I think you can bring that equitable distribution of resource into the corporate and private sector too. And I think you're starting to see that with a lot of the movement in professional sports and whatnot, because again, the NBA's always made, for example, made money, but now they're challenged to make equitable investments into communities of color, especially the African American community with the Black Lives Matter movement, which is awesome, right? And so it's not just public sector alone; it's private sector. I challenge anybody who works in the private sector on this call, who watches this, to reflect on that and see if your corporation is making those equitable investments, not only in the philanthropic corporate giving, because I worked in that in Nike, but in the business side, the marketing, who your vendors are, right? There's a lot of things that you can do, because communities of color not only have to be physically healthy, but we need to be financially healthy as well. And I doubt that any corporation is doing the best job that they could when it comes to contracting or hiring. Because, a job, right? A 100,000 plus paying job is a pretty good job, right? But there's African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans and are far and few in those jobs.
Ebony, do you have thoughts to share on this?
Just kind of piggybacking on what Anthony said, it just made me think too, is that, because I go between this process of, how do you convey and communicate so that folks can really understand and conceptualize what it is that we're saying. And so within that, you have to be able to speak to those who are process-oriented versus those who are highly linear. And so I just want to say that data or the research demonstrates when you focus on race and ethnicity, you end up impacting everything else. And so oftentimes when we are having these conversations around, how do we improve our outcomes? How do we get to greater places that are more equitable? How do we do this or that? Focusing on race and ethnicity, in my opinion, is a great place to start, because you will have a larger and a more collective impact. To specifically answer your question, and Anthony kind of spoke to it also, I think about the equity lens. And so the equity lens is this process where when you're thinking about planning, programming, design, evaluation, policy, decision-making, you're asking yourself a set of questions in terms of thinking about who's going to benefit and who's disadvantaged in this process, this change, this strategy. You also ask yourself and create space to make sure that those who traditionally don't have a voice or an opportunity to be at the table, you're bringing them in. You're thinking about what are the unintended consequences? What's the adverse impact that may result in this decision or change or implementation or whatever. So I highly recommend that folks, learn about and educate and familiarize themselves with being able to use an equity lens and really kind of all that you do from policy to practice. That's my short, simple answer.
So one of the questions I was going to ask was about kind of like, what are the important questions to be asking? So I think you really addressed it in the sense of like, how do we apply that racial equity lens, and what data are we pulling, right? How are we getting that key data to continue to inform what we're doing and making sure that it's distributed throughout Oregon? I do have a couple of last questions, but I want to make sure that if there are folks here that also have questions that we're addressing those. So feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat so that we can make sure to respond to that. One of the questions I have is, it came out of a past listening session, or one of the Tuesday night sessions. I don't know what that's technically called, where someone had mentioned a question of like, we're very clear in the time of COVID, in the time of looking at police reform, at looking at racial injustice. We are very clear about what we and our values are against. And we are against discrimination. We are against racism. We are against police brutality. We are against, not taking seriously climate justice. And so I guess I want to kind of spin this a little bit to say, the question that came out of that was, if we are very clear about the things that we are against, what are we for? So what do Oregonians stand for in the sense of when we get past this pandemic, when we will continue to be looking at addressing racial inequity? But what are we for as Oregonians, as senior fellows? What do we stand for? And I'd really love to hear your take.
Well, I think for me, I think so I wrote down the words knowledge, equity, social justice, accountability. And, I think it's important that Oregonians, understand, know the history, educate yourself, take the time so that then you understand and you know why people are out there protesting and using their voice and fighting. Because oftentimes, one of the issues, I'm not even gonna go there. We're gonna say focus. I'm gonna say focus. So knowledge and education in terms of understanding the current issues in the history. I've already talked about equity. Accountability is a key piece. And, I think one of the other things is, CM, I appreciate you saying that, because we can talk about all of the deficits, the gaps, the problems, the issue, but then when you're presented with the opportunity to say then, well, what is it that you want? Folks are kind of like tongue twisted and like, well, I don't know. And so what do I aim? I want to see increased graduation rates for our students who identify with the Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. I want to see mortality rates go down amongst, Black women and brown women, specific to, birth rates and things like that. I want to see the wealth gap close. I want to be able to see, increased home ownership. So it's things like that, and being able to articulate, the numbers and the percentages. I want to see increased people of color utilizing behavioral health services. I want to see our continuum of care further diversified. I want to see our traditional ways of healing incorporated into education and into wellness.
I love that. Anthony.
Well, that's a tough one. I think what comes to mind is what I want to see is peace. I want to see hope. I want to see that we care about our fellow Oregonians, regardless of where you live, in rural or urban. I want to see selflessness, and I want to see service. I think a lot of those, again, I'm a very simple-minded person, but I think that if we start there, a lot of things start taking care of themselves. I know that there's bad things in this world, but I choose not to live in darkness, but really live in the light and look at what we want to be. And I think that, the Latino community, we've been slapped in the face, so to speak, many times. And I know for a fact that we've turned and given our other cheek to that. And I think that's what makes our community very strong, that we're not going to just focus on the bad things, that we will always look for the future and for the hope and what this great state has provided my family and those that are just arriving. So it's not a political, I mean, you know what I mean? It's again, it's not a system. That's not my personality, but that's just my being, what I grew up around. And I've been blessed to see things before they existed, like Colegio Cesar Chavez, Cocoon Farm Worker Union, Salud Medical Center. My family helped build, created those things. They didn't exist. It was just a vision. And people had rallied around our community of farm workers and others, allies eventually, and we created those things. So I think if we all here collectively have a vision, that's what we strive for. The others and everything, I think, in my mind, simple mind, will fall into place. Now, is it easy? Is there bad? Is there all of these negative things, police brutality, criminal? Do we need all that? Absolutely. You will not get that. Latinos have been victims of police brutality, murders. I mean, that's just something that just has happened in our communities, and things don't surprise us anymore, right? But I think what's missing is that peace and hope and selflessness and service. And I think if we can think about those and how we get to where we want to be with that in the back of our mind, I think we can address a lot of these issues.
And I think Anthony inspired me, so I just have to say this line. The other thing that I want to see all of us take opportunity to make our mark in history. That's what I want.
I just want to add that I want to see the things that have been set up in COVID times, like linguistic access. I want to see that continue to be standard and not just because of a global pandemic. I would like to see that access, because I think that's going to continue to promote and affirm Oregonians' dignity. I did see that Katie had a question, then I have another question unless other folks do, but Katie, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I just have to say how much gratitude first to start, and how honored I am to be a part of this conversation, and really, really appreciating this conversation. And so the question of what we're about and what we're for, I'm for liberation and peace as well, and justice. So I'm there with everyone in this. And my question is related to what are the top 1 to 3 things we could do, Ebony and Anthony, very specifically in work that you're working on, where we can channel our funds and channel our networks, and CM as you too, as well, as we think about very direct asks that we would have for one another. And then I just also want to give a shout out to Alf related to changing my mindset in very deep fundamental ways. And as a Oregon-born person with a lot of privilege and access, it's allowed me to create a completely new understanding in language. So huge gratitude there too.
I think for me, I know you said 3, the 2 top things that come to mind for me, what are some key things that you can do right away? Start to build relationship with your neighbors, as Anthony spoke to. Start to build relationship, especially with those that are within your sphere that identify with the Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities. And then I would say, regardless of what it is that you do, learn about the equity lens and then start using it, starting with looking at your mission, your vision, your policies, your aim. Those are the 2 key things that came to mind for me.
How about that? More pretty?
Yeah.
Nice. I would say, Katie, thank you for being here with us. And 2 things that come to mind are your gift to Oregon and to the world. I think you start there, Katie. What is it that you love and you have passion for? What's your treasure? What's something that you do without even thinking about? And maybe apply that to the communities of color and sharing your gift with those communities, whether they be young people or all the way to retirees, document wherever you see fit, because I think that's what we're here for. We all have a gift. I've said this before, and I think it's our purpose, and this, again, my opinion, to share that gift with the world. And I think that that's where I would say that you would start.
And this is Sam. I'll also say that two things just from my own background. When I got elected to the Newport City Council, I was the first queer person elected. And I have a background in like also working to get LGBTQ affirming folks elected and women elected. But I would also say we need to get more people of color elected. We have to get them elected at all levels of Oregon's governance. And that includes school board, like Anthony served on the school board. That includes city council, that includes county commissioners, that includes legislative offices and above. But we have to get more people to reflect that diversity in our state. And the other thing I'll say is, and this is going to seem a little bit out of the box, but hold fundraising workshops, because some of our local, smaller social organizations really rely on local dollars, and they don't have a lot of grant funding and a lot of support, but teaching people how to fundraise can continue to sustain local entities, and people are often more generous in smaller communities, but they don't necessarily know how to ask people for money or how to grow their own fundraising network. So those are a little bit out of the box maybe, but those are the two things that I would say are things that can continue to help people, is like, look at your network of influence, and encourage people to run for office that maybe wouldn't otherwise think about it. But if Anthony weren't already elected or haven't been elected and understood the system, I would be like, Anthony, you need to run for office right now. And Ebony, I don't know where you live or what you're doing, but you need to run for office, because that leverage also has a lot of influence. So I just want to add that. I did see Sue's remarks in the comments about the perspective of her being in Southern Oregon and having to kind of endure so much of the wildfires and COVID. The big key takeaways is to get to know your neighbors, to seek to help individuals one-on-one, and continue to listen and listen and listen. Lastly, this has been a hard year already for so many of us, just having to withstand a lot of personal tragedy and just collective tragedy, losing John Lewis, losing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, losing George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and so many others, and Ahmaud Arbery. And we are continuing to push through to an important election, as Tom mentioned. I guess I want to ask and leave on a positive and high note. Ebony and Anthony, thank you so much for being here. Lisa and Kelly, Melissa from the ALF staff, thank you to the Senior Fellows who are watching. But can we just leave with, like, what is inspiring you? What is keeping you lifted up in these times? Is there anything that we can maybe draw from your inspiration on?
Let me answer that first, and I'm sorry for talking so much, but I go back to when the American Leadership Forum of Oregon was founded, and Joe Jaworski left twice because his vision was a community-based organization, sometimes including suburbs around the city. Our founders rejected that and would only consider doing this statewide. We were in the middle of what my economics background says was a depression, not a recession. The timber industry was in the toilet. We were having incredible problems. And as somebody who's been involved in the selection process since we began it, our three commitments that we have continued to focus on is that half of our participants will be women, that we will aggressively and actively engage rural Oregon to be a part of what we're talking about. And maybe most importantly, we will aggressively and actively seek out minority participants in each and every class. And I want to just give a shout out to Lisa and Kelly and Melissa for helping continue this dream that, as I said earlier, none of us thought would last longer than 5 years. And it's because of people like you that have joined us each year and understand how desperately we need one another. And if you don't remember what it's like going down the face of a rock with somebody on belay for you, recall that experience, because we need everyone. And CM, you've done a phenomenal job with Anthony of moderating this. Thank you.
Thanks, with Anthony and Ebony. Thank you. Anthony and Ebony, final words, anything that's giving you some inspiration right now that we can maybe draw from?
I think for me, people of color, we are resilient, and we have to find ways to wake up and push ourselves every day. And so, but honestly, what is giving me hope, what is inspiring me is this. And like I said, never in my lifetime did I think that my white brothers and sisters across Oregon would stand and use their voice to create change for people of color. So I'm just saying, that's inspiring. And so, and I truly believe in, the urban and rural kind of connection and place and space that we have to hold. And so for me too, when I talk about equity, I'm talking about geographic equity also.
Can I jump in here for a minute?
Oh,
I
sure.
just want to say that, CM, I'm so proud of this discussion. You did a great job. And I just want to say that several years ago, I made a call to CM. And she'd had a little trouble in her ALF class, and everything just wasn't going perfectly for her. And I just want to say that we should all do that. Pick up the phone if you know somebody in ALF for any circumstance. We have 900 of us. Pick up the phone, get to know this incredible network. And I'm just so glad that I picked up the phone and talked to you, CM, and you've done a great job today. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Anthony.
Mine, I'll just go back to the beginning. What inspires me are the undocumented, the immigrant, the indigenous Mesoamericans, the poor, the homeless, the incarcerated, the voiceless. That's where I get my inspiration. I've got that. I get to see that every single day in the humble community I live. And as I drive around, even in rural, and see our people working, that's truly where I get my inspiration from.
I want to say thank you all. We went beyond the time because this is such a rich conversation. Sarah, thank you for fielding questions as we went. There is another session at 1:30, and then you all know there's the gala at 6 o'clock tonight. I hope that this does get out to folks. I think we've had such really beautiful content, and for all of you, thank you for your continued service to the state of Oregon. And as Sue said, pick up the phone, call another ALF fellow. And I think we'll wrap it there. Thanks again for the time and the opportunity to have the first What Now, What Then session. Thanks.